Hello everyone, I am Jonathan, also known as the PC Genie. Now of course today we're going to be talking about ancient barbarians and how they likely would have fought. Now bear in mind a lot of this is conjecture and based on the sorts of things that we know from different periods in history using different combinations of weapons. Because when it comes to the fighting styles of people in the ancient times, there are little to no sources, no written sources even about much in terms of even the Romans, the people famous for having a very well documented history during their empire. So unfortunately we don't know exactly how people like barbarians fought, however we can have a pretty good guess. So regarding that, in terms of the typical barbarian, I'm going to talk about your sort of Iron Age barbarian. I mean you've got ones from sort of Bronze Age and earlier and all sorts, but it starts to vary quite a bit, and the further back we go, the more we don't know, basically. So it starts because, of course, where's the difference between maybe a Stone Age person who's just sort of improvised, maybe picking up a hunting spear and using it for warfare, and then maybe the tribes later on. It ends up, getting even worse still. So we'll probably talk about Iron Age and later. So anyway, when it comes to your standard armaments, I mean, I have got... It's fairly anachronistic because I don't have enough Patreon money to afford all the best equipment, but this should give you a rough idea of what a well-off barbarian might have for their equipment. If you had a helmet, you would have usually something like some mail armour, some sort of padded jacket or gambeson underneath. You'd have a round shield which has a boss and is centre grip, not strapped. You would normally have some sort of spear or other polearm, and of course a sword. Now, of course, some barbarians didn't have swords, that's fine. Spears are very useful weapons, and some did, which is also something that's quite useful in a battle, especially if someone's getting inside the reach of your spear. And most likely, they would have had something like some sort of knife or dagger, which would also be something they could use if things get into grappling range. I'm talking, wrestling, I can reach with my arms type of range. But normally anyone who's got a brain on doesn't want that to happen. Now yes, some people have got these representations of barbarians as people, who just were crazy and would just go into battle just bare-chested and would just have at them. Now yes, there were certain incidents which, so even now it's slightly dubious depending on the sources you're looking at, where people would have, for example, painted themselves with woad before battle, which would be basically a sort of a ritualistic thing to do, much in the same way as people like the Spartans would often actually groom their hair and do other things before they go into battle. Now, whether you want to think it's for going into some sort of angry trance or just a sort of ritual to prepare and almost normalise the fact that you may well die the next day, that's up to you to decide. But when it comes to the actual techniques, that's what I know best. So, when you are a barbarian fighting, of course, with your shield and with your spear, you have a few ways that you can use it. When you're in a formation, or whether you're alone, you can always do various jabs, and you can go from underneath, so I've got the item held like this, an overhand grip, so I can keep jabbing. I can either use the shield separately, so I can go, for example, block high, stab low, or I can keep it, I call it sort of tight action in fighting, where you use your shield to cover the weapon itself. So for example, I might jab and go, ha! So I'm keeping this angle blocked with my shield, and then at the same time I'm thrusting with the spear. In this case I've got a bill hook, that was fine. But apart from that, you can have an underhand grip and do pretty much the same thing. It doesn't matter if I'm going to get a bit tired, I can stick the item in the ground a bit, I can rest it on my shoulder. It's not as hard to do overhand technique because I've heard some people proclaim. I've already done it myself, trying to do this kind of thing. It's not that tiring. So, when you're using the spear overhand, again, you can either block one angle, jab with another angle, so I can do various things like that and go around, or I can keep it tight and start jabbing in various fashions like that. So that is how you would use something like a spear. Of course, most of you guys like swords, so I will also talk about swords. Now, these sorts of swords aren't like your medieval swords, which were typically slightly more back-weighted, typically had a bit of a better thrusting point. In fact, some were even specialised more towards thrusting. Your average barbarian sword was a cutter. Not to say it was clumsy to use, but more that it would be a bit more forward-weighted. There'd be more reliance on the broad cutting edges rather than the thrusting point. So although it is still a cut and thrust weapon, we're looking at something that is mostly going to be doing cutting. So when I've got my sword and shield, pretty much the same as before, I can either use the sword and the shield separately, so block one angle, cut at the other, or I can use them tightly together, so like this, for example. So you have to bear in mind, there will be a lot more actions that involve tight actions and making sure you've got your sword arm protected, because unlike in the medieval period, when I'm a barbarian, except for things like maybe some padded gloves or something like that, there's no evidence ever that I've seen regarding any form of armour for the hands. Now yes, there are certain types of armour, including the mail, which can extend down to the wrists. There are other types of armour which can also protect the wrists as well, but the actual hands are basically never protected properly. So I don't want to be doing any of this sort of putting my hand out in front of the shield, because all that's going to happen is my finger's going to get cut off, my hand is going to be carved open, and I'll end up dropping my weapon and screaming in pain. I don't want that, even though I'm a barbarian, and according to the Romans, I just want to scream and get in there. No! It's one of the things that's wrong about it. So, when it comes to barbarian fighting, from what I believe, again, this is more conjecture, although it seems that the Romans and other such civilized cultures did better in battles, generally speaking, especially in open fields with organised lines, than people like the barbarians did, I don't really think that they were worse at fighting as such. From what I see, it seems that barbarians were more, I would call them duelists. So, in fact, they're pretty much people like me in real life. Not to say that I'm a barbarian despite my long hair and a beard, but that aside, when I've got a sword and shield or whatever I'm using, two-handed swords, whatever weapon style I'm using, I've done sparring, I know certain techniques, so if I'm against another man or another woman who's got some weapon set like me, I can reasonably hold my own. However, when it comes to the awareness of being in something like a group fight and making sure not to be struck in the back or the sides and making sure to protect each other, yes, I have an understanding logically of what I should be doing, making sure I don't turn my back to the opponent, making sure I'm not just, going in between people to sort of stave them off at once or anything like that. But when it comes to all actually practicing it, the intricacies and, making sure actually physically not getting caught in between a hammer and a rock and a hard place rather, that's something I'm not practiced with. And I would guess that to a degree that is how things were for the barbarians. So there would be plenty of instances where they've done duels against each other, they would have fought in skirmishes, and there would have been perhaps a lot more individual fighting. And even practice when you're not doing any kind of duel or warfare, they'd be doing some regular practice as part of their warrior culture at home. But it seems that a lot of it is individualistic fighting. So I've got this cutting sword, I've got this shield, I know to keep myself protected as I fight, I know to make sure to deliver various angles, I know how to do the correct wrist action for swinging of a sword and not just flailing clumsily. So that's all good. But when it comes to a battle, I'm not used to fighting in an organised line, I'm not used to all of these sorts of complicated fashions of battle, and therefore that's why people like the Romans do better against the barbarians. So again, the barbarians aren't bad fighters, it's just that they're not good on the battlefield, they're duelists. So that's my thoughts on the barbarians in terms of how they fought in close combat. If you want any discussions regarding things like slings, javelins and bows in projectile combat, let me know. If not, and you want something else, tell me as well. Let me know in the comments. I am, after all, the PC Genie, and I grant people's wishes. So, have a good day, and see you guys later.